Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our weekly 2 cents segment where we'll take a plain English look at the big three property news stories of the week. I'm joined by the king of mortgage broking, Mr. Chris Bates. Hello, Chris.
Hey, always good to chat. How are you doing?
I'm really good, thanks. So thank you everyone for joining. So every Sunday morning at 7 a.m, you'll find our 2 cents podcast episode waiting for you in your podcast player. And we have a bit of fun each week. This week, Chris and I will be taking a look at the big three property news stories of the week. Before we get on to that, Chris, how's your week been?
Well, it was good. I was up in your neck of the woods. We were going to catch up, but trying to escape a 3 and a 1 year old and a wife for a personal coffee was a bit harder than I thought it would be. So we did miss each other, but it was a nice week up in Noosa, even though the weather was the 1 week, I think, in the month where it just rained the whole week. But other than that, business is going well. Life's good. What's happened on your end?
Yeah, I mean, the weather's actually picked up as soon as you left. But yeah, I've been actually at the Gold Coast all week this week. There's a conference that I speak at annually. And it's interesting, actually, the property sentiment, even since October, November, is notably higher than it was late last year. Even though interest rates went up this week, there's definitely been a groundswell or a shift in favour of people buying property again. I think people are starting to get a bit more comfortable, and also probably a bit of a housing shortage happening, which is encouraging renters into the market. So, yeah, it's been a good week, though, a really glorious week on the Gold Coast, and the kids always enjoy going down to surfers and doing all of that stuff. I've not been getting enough sleep, but that's another story.
I think you're right about the sentiment. I think the media is a big part to play in that. I just jumped off a call an hour ago and they were mentioning, a 7:30 report or something that the market's going to boom again. That's what they've watched something in the media that's now turning positive. You've got all the core logic coming out, the bottom's passed and all these sort of, I think a lot of people are sometimes a little bit late to the party. The bottom was actually late last year, which we've already spoke about on this podcast. But yeah, sentiment's definitely shit. We can see that also into inquiry, pre-approvals looking to, renew, existing clients coming back to us. We've definitely seen a big uptick, gradually over the year. And the RBA rate increase, which we're not speaking about today, but, that surprised everyone. But I think it was probably the right move, to be honest. Just, let Australians know that we're not out of the woods just yet. Don't go and spend all your money and create an inflation problem for us again. But, yeah, it did surprise the market a little bit, that.
I think as somebody with a mortgage, I was sort of secretly hoping for another pause. But actually, I think if you're being objective, there is definitely a case of either kill inflation now or risk it resurfacing later in the year. So I think, if I was the Reserve Bank governor, I would have done the same thing. But even though there's somebody with some mortgage debt, you're obviously always hoping for lower mortgage rates. But on balance, probably the right decision. I will probably slow down spending in the economy over the next 6 months.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, those rate increases will probably be given back in rate cuts at some point. It's just maybe a little bit higher for a little bit longer, but maybe the cuts start sooner, when it is under control. So that's obviously the name of the game. So what 3 stories we're going to do this week, Pete?
Yeah, you're right. The financial markets, if you look at pricing out until 2024, we're actually just getting sharper cuts now. So a bit more pain in the short term, but probably gets given back later on. Bill Evans forecasting 4 rate cuts in 2024. Gareth Aird, who's from CBA, forecasting rate cuts starting later in 2023. So he thinks that inflation won't even be back to target. He just thinks they'll be cutting sooner because the economy will be struggling so much. So yes, this week's 3 main news stories. So firstly, the retreat from the regions, which was a phrase coined by James Kirby at The Australian, wrote an interesting piece this week citing some figures from PropTrack, particularly on rental market demand. Secondly, an article from Fairfax we picked up on Sydney's richest and poorest postcodes and how that is measured in terms of gentrification. And thirdly, we're going to talk about what first home buyers can do about low stock levels. So markets are very tight. Stock listings have actually been falling over recent weeks and months. So what can first home buyers do, particularly in the context of the Albanese federal government has announced a range of new stimulus measures for people who may be able to team up to buy either with friends or siblings or parents to buy jointly. So we'll take a look at what all that means as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I just going back to your point around sort of Gareth and Bill Evans, their comments. I think it's interesting. Shane Oliver came out this week and just basically admitted how wrong he got it, you know, in terms of he was predicting massive property falls. And I remember back in the 2018 and in other years where he's also got it wrong. He's a bit of a character, Shane, and he admits when he's wrong. And it's interesting. We can see that a little bit with the banking economists now as well. They're all changing their forecasts. It was only 3 or 4 months ago they were still, forecasting massive declines to the markets, and now they're flipped all their forecasts in a week from negative numbers to positive numbers for the property market. And so you've got to be very careful basing anything on these any type of forecaster. So let's go to this first one around the retreat to the regions. Pete, what's the biggest story here? What's the story saying?
Yeah, I think if you look at rental vacancy rates around the country, we've got vacancy rates rising in Noosa, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Mornington Peninsula, Blue Mountains, Hobart, Canberra. So yes, we've got a housing shortage emerging. So the RBA actually did a speech today citing that we've got population growth surging ahead of previous expectations, but building approvals falling away. So in the medium term, big shortage of housing, but that's mainly going to be a capital city thing by the looks of it. So the article which caught our eye from James Kirby, he sort of highlighted a potential reversal of the pandemic era rush to the regions, and now rental demand is surging back into the capitals. And he highlighted some figures from PropTrack, which is owned by REA Group. So rental inquiries per property plunging by 42% across regional Australia. Also massive drops in Hobart and Canberra, down 75%, 72% and 65%. But on the other side of the coin, in Melbourne, inquiry per property up 55% from a year ago. So I guess this kind of makes sense. A lot of people rushed out to those country towns during the pandemic restrictions, and but now that some of that's going into reverse, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was NAB this week, which I saw that you picked up on as well. They sort of said you got to get back to the office 5 days. One of my clients, one of the bigs at a company, I was chatting to him last week around the whole work from home thing, and he goes, "No, we're getting everyone back." It was one of his jobs as responsibilities in the business. He was saying, no, everyone's come back to the office. They're not working from home anymore. And I think that's what's happening is this shift of the fight between the tug of war between, employees and employers. I think employers are really pulling that really hard right now to get back to the office. And we're seeing it with clients, their desire to move to the regions is really evaporating just because of this uncertainty with work. You don't want to move to a region and then potentially, and even if you negotiate it, that you could potentially work at this company for a certain amount of days from home. You've also got to think about, well, what happens if that company isn't where I want to stay and I want to get a new job, or something happens at that company? Could I get the same job working regionally, or would I have to go back to the city? And I think people are very nervous there. So it makes a lot of sense that, and a lot of people want to try before they buy, because it was really hard to buy in the regions the last couple of years. So you wanted to move up their way to help you find something. So that's why I think your rental demands really come off. And then maybe people have moved back as well, right? Because they did move up there, and so they're no longer acquiring. Their leases are finishing and they're moving back to the city as well. So not only people not moving there, but also people moving back because of the return to work.
James Kirby said in the article, the entirely logical decision to bolt from the big cities to anywhere that offered a better lifestyle triggered what may well be a once-in-a-generation price increase for many country towns. So it also meant rental vacancy rates were actually lower in some regional towns than the cities, a situation nobody in the market had ever seen before. We had some friends in Brisbane who lived up the top of one of the tower blocks in Queen Street. They bought a unit there some years ago, and they were saying because of the COVID restrictions, there was only one person allowed in the lift at a time, effectively rendering the lift useless to people who lived on the higher floors. So in that context, probably not that surprising that a lot of people got out of those inner city apartments. But now what we're seeing, CoreLogic put out their rental index this week for the first quarter of 2023. We've got record high rental price growth in the capital cities, driven by inner city apartments, but rental price growth in regional Australia is easing. So that kind of probably reflects exactly what PropTrack have found as well, that just as you said, people are going back to the cities, partly for work, partly because employers are needing it, maybe for job security, maybe as well some people just not enjoying the regional lifestyle as much as they might have expected, possibly.
Yeah, I think there's always that Goldilocks sort of, utopia idea in the regions. The farmer moved to the farmer lifestyle, and I do think a lot of people go there and they don't get the connections they need to and do move back to the city. I think it's one of the tree change and then back to the cities common over the years, and naturally it would have been in this situation as well, especially if your commute has gone from 1 day to 4 days. I do think there is a shift though long term, because I do think that the talent, flexibility and remote work does work for some industries and some jobs, and some businesses like ours are offering that. And so I do think as more and more companies take that policy on to get talent, and if they can set their businesses up there in a technological way, the commuter towns off the capital cities will do really well. So I do think the Central Coast and Wollongongs and Morningtons and Geelongs and Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast and the ones that are commutable to the city will do really well. It's just that they went up so much in those 2 years. Like you're talking, 60, 70, 80%, if not more, right, these locations. And so, some of that growth is probably coming back. But I do think ultimately the scarce parts they're really small locations. The places, the amount of beaches on the Central Coast or Wollongong or Sunshine Coast, where people really want to be, they're not big markets. So it doesn't take much for that supply-demand thing to level up again and, growth to come back. So I don't think it's over for the region. I just think they're going through a bit of adjustment period after such a huge growth in 2021.
Yeah, overheated. I think you're right. There's a stock versus flow thing here. Some of those smaller markets, it doesn't take much of a change in demand to suddenly say there's nothing on the market. And we had that through the pandemic, but now sort of going into reverse. And I think you're right. Some of those peri-urban locations, long term, the demand will be fine. But now we've got the cash rate has gone from 0 to 4, and some of those markets where people are paying enormous prices, especially on the coast. And we're starting to see them come back down. Certainly in my part of the world, a lot of properties that would have sold in a day or two are now sitting on the market unsold. So that suggests a correction ahead.
Absolutely. Let's go number 2, Pete, the richest and poorest postcodes. It's a bit of a funny title. It depends on what you think's rich and poor, I guess.
This was a McCrindle piece of research. So richest and poorest postcodes based on 23 different criteria. And what they're really talking about is suburbs that have seen a gentrification, particularly from working class to affluent. So number 1 on the list was Erskineville, which is a small inner west suburb, pretty close to Newtown and Alexandria. And there's a range of other suburbs that have really transformed from working class areas to more affluent enclaves in recent years. Balmain, Newtown, Surrey Hills, Redfern, and even before that, the Rocks and Barangaroo, which previously had a lot of public or social housing, but now are massively in demand. So pretty interesting. I think the thing that stood out to me, Chris, was some of the highly ranked suburbs on this list weren't necessarily the most advantaged postcodes, which is places like Woollahra on the harbour side, but places that scored highly, places like Mount Druitt and Penrith, St Mary's, Blacktown. In other words, places that are improving because they are close to employment hubs. And the places that are really struggling are the greenfield housing sites, so those new house and land estates where there's no public transport, no connection to employment, and just basically no amenities that people can easily get to.
Yeah, I think that sort of makes sense, right? Like I guess, gets a community is that sort of real people sticking around, people investing in their homes, people investing in the community, right, over generations. And that's something you cannot create in a housing estate, right? And I think that's also, jobs, businesses, schools, infrastructure, etc. And I think what happens is more and more people get pushed out of potentially the areas they would love to live. Maybe it's a bit closer to work, maybe it's a bit closer to the lifestyle or the beach or the water, etc. They do have to go further afield. And I would say this also shows that, potentially there's great growth also if it is not in the inner or middle ring, but it's in an area that has got all those fundamentals of an established housing stock that people are going to move to. And ultimately that place is going to gentrify and become better to live as this, new money and new people move in, basically. And that's what's happening is the city kind of gets a whole other wave, or that part of the city. So that's what I took from this article is that, the cities do change, right? And livability does change. And I would say you just got to be very careful on these greenfield housing estates. People on this podcast will probably know that by now, but also that, you can still do well in the middle and outer rings in property investment if you focus on the right fundamentals.
I think the global experience shows that once cities go past around 5 million in population, the livability suddenly deteriorates. You can't drive around as easily, can't go and park at the beach in Sydney like you used to be able to.
Yep.
So I think that suggests that those key employment and transport hubs are important. I saw Simon Kustenmacher from the Demographics Group present this week, and he talks about the new fried egg model of capital cities. It used to be very CBD-centric in Sydney and Melbourne, but now people don't necessarily commute from Penrith to the Sydney CBD or North Sydney. They could just as easily be commuting to a place of work in the sort of Western Sydney hubs. Likewise in Parramatta or Blacktown. It doesn't suggest that everybody's heading into the CBD and back out again later in the day. Instead, it's difficult to show on a podcast, but the fried egg model essentially shows that people are commuting maybe 15-minute distances to various employment hubs all around Sydney, and I'm sure Melbourne will develop in the same way. And I think if you fast forward to a couple of decades' time, we wouldn't really think of Sydney as being CBD-centric. We'd have Sydney and North Sydney, we'd have Parramatta in the middle, and then a Western Sydney hub out west with an airport.
Yeah, I mean, the Greater Sydney plan is those three cities. I think it is the city, the Parkland, and I'm not sure if it's the central city as well, which is the Parramatta, right? Because I think it's the geographically the actual centre of Sydney, I think it is. And absolutely, I think this whole COVID thing is showing that flexible work and working from home is there as well. So even if you are coming to the city, though, you can live in one of these locations and potentially commute 2 days. I think pre-COVID, one of the safest bets was to buy along the train lines, right, of the capital cities, because, people wanted the getting to and from work, and the commute time was really important, because if you're working long hours and you've got to get to the city, you want to get home fast to see your kids, and you want to leave a little bit later in the morning. And I think that's why the train lines. But when COVID changed, we saw a lot of clients say, well, I'm willing to live 10 minutes from the train line or 20 minutes because I can get better bang for buck. I can get a bigger house. I can get more land. And I'm only going to do that walk, 2 times a week, not 5 times a week. Or 10 times a week if you're going morning and night. So, I think that's part of this story as well, is that, I think as the city explodes, with different changes to more work hubs and the work from home, I think that's what we're going to see is great little pockets in and around the city.
We've seen things similar in Brisbane suburbs like Oxley, which used to be thought of as a distant edge of the city or city fringe type of location, but now it's a genuine hub. It's got a good train station, good schools nearby, got Woolworths. You can easily stop by for a coffee, decent amenities, and gentrifying every time you go back. And I think the sort of cautionary note here that McCrindle highlighted is just some of those areas of greenfield housing. They're just a long way from anything. And not particularly at a time when we've got all kinds of risks in the building and construction sector. Just want to be a bit careful in some of those areas, because they really struggle to transform over time without the access to amenities. And if you have to drive everywhere, it's just not very easy.
Yeah, I think livability and property values are very interlinked, right? The best places to live and raise a family and offer the greatest lifestyle benefits in lots of different facets, from commute to health to nature to trees to walkability to etc. So livability has lots of different factors. And I think if you think about property in that sense, then you can really start to see, well, why would that property be worth more in the future? Because it's got greater livability. Schools are a big part of that, etc. So if you type livability and property, you'll find there's lots of attributes to it. And it's a good way to understand the property market on a local level.
Indeed. Well, let's take a look at this third news story of the week, Chris. So the federal government announced yet more stimulus measures for the housing market, this time new changes to Australia's housing scheme. So the federal government will expand the eligibility criteria of their 3 housing schemes to help more Aussies purchase their own property. So now siblings can team up, potentially 2 friends or a parent and a child could jointly apply for the 3 housing schemes from 1 July. So programs will be available to home buyers who haven't owned a property in the past decade, and Australian permanent residents will also be eligible for all 3 of the schemes. So these schemes are rarely popular in the media. I mean, it's great if you're one of the people who qualify, but generally they just pump more demand into the market without tackling the supply issue. And I think that's what we wanted to talk about a bit today, Chris, because a lot of first home buyers will qualify and potentially millions more Aussies could buy under these schemes. But it's very hard at the moment in some of those capital city markets because there's so little stock for sale. And we've noticed particularly actually in that sub 750 bracket, maybe because borrowing capacities have come down a bit, but stuff gets listed and stuff gets sold. It's very, very difficult. So what do you think about the schemes, Chris? So that's first home buyer guarantee, regional home buyer guarantee, and the family home guarantee. And now more people can potentially team up either with friends or siblings and buy together.
Yeah, it's a hard one. Government incentives for first home buyers, are they good or are they not? I think they're good for people who use them right now, and it allows them to get into the market. I don't know if it's great for the housing affordability, right? But are we trying to solve housing affordability for some people today? We're trying to solve it as a big problem as a society over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think that's my issue with a lot of these housing schemes is they very quickly get factored into the price. You create more demand on a limited number of listings and that's ultimately what pushes prices up. So someone feels like they get a benefit, but they're usually paying more for the property. This is what we've instantly seen this with the first home buyer choice scheme in New South Wales to not pay stamp duty and to pay land tax up to 1.5 million. Properties have been selling that should be selling at 1.3 or 1.4 are selling for 1.5 on the nose because of that scheme. And so, they're not paying stamp duty, but they're entering the market, but I think they've overpaid for the property because of the scheme. But the choice is if they didn't buy the property, they wouldn't be in the market and then they wouldn't get the growth if the market keeps going up. So they're always a catch-22, especially I don't really like government schemes that push people towards new property. So, first home buy building grants or, first home buy grants that if you buy a new property, ultimately I think you're stitching up the next generation, making them buy poor assets to support a construction industry, which creates more housing, but the person who's dealing with that is the first home buyer who's got the least amount to lose, and he's taking the biggest risk. So I guess that's my overall feeling of schemes. These schemes are only ultimately going to create more demand, by I don't know how much, you're going to say the single is buying with, brothers or sisters or friends or with parents, etc. But, if it does mean that more people are into the home ownership category rather than renting and having the instability of that, we can see through, then I think that's a good thing. And if it increases our home ownership rate, I think that's a good thing. It's just that it will lead to higher prices. What can they do about lower stock? Well, there's potentially always stock to buy. The challenge is waiting for the good stuff. And I think that's the challenge here, that a lot of first-home buyers don't know what to buy and what not to buy. Informed buyers, for example, know how to be patient and to say, actually, no, that's not great. Okay, I'm going to go for this one. But unfortunately, a lot of people entering the property market for the first time, and especially when parents, sisters or brothers are encouraging them or work colleagues, none of them really know what to do. And a lot of first-home buyers, unfortunately don't buy great assets.
To some degree, I guess it depends on where you live in the country. I saw that listings are trending higher in some parts of the country. So Wollongong, Canberra, Hobart and Darwin are some examples of where listings are picking up. But if you look around Queensland, total listings are very low. I think that's partly reflected people interstate moves from Victoria and New South Wales. There's just nothing on the market. I think looking further ahead, well, SQM research reported that new listings were down more than 20% in April, and total listings are very, very low in lots of parts of the country. So, it depends on where you're looking to buy. And looking further out, Robert Gottliebson in the Australian said land sales are down 70%, and most builders are losing money now because of a lot of construction that happened on fixed price contracts, and price of materials and trades have shot up. And so I think we're probably Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane are heading for some pretty bad shortages of housing over the next few years. So intuitively, if you've got the ability to save a deposit and buy in those cities, it does make sense, but it's very challenging to try and find the stock to buy. What about things like buying off market, Chris? Is that something that a first home buyer can do?
So, generally, I think if you're a first-home buyer, you're in the market, agents know about it. You're on their hit list, their hot list. The desperado meters up pretty high in their eyes. I think you can get access to things that are off-market potentially. Got to be really careful off-market. So we could do a whole episode on that. But pre-markets, it's a good place to be, where a seller's definitely keen to buy. They're going to go down the marketing campaign, but they just want a quick deal for some reason. And you're the right buyer who gets access to it first, and you can make the deal happen. I think that's definitely a place you want to be. And the only way to do that is to be in the agent's ears and then to really know that you're ready to go. They're not going to give a pre-market viewing to anybody. Obviously, you can also afford to buy it. If you can afford a buyer's agent, it's a great idea because they're more likely to get those pre-markets and off-markets than you would be. And they're also more likely to stop you buying a lemon if you can pick the right one. But Pete and I both know you've got to be really careful who you choose in this space. It's a real two-speed industry. I hope I'm not being offensive, Pete. I think there's the top of the tree lot, who's a very small bunch, actually. It's not many buyers agents have been doing the job for more than 5 years and a real local specialist, and it's their calling. Then you got the new lot that have been doing it for 0 to 3 years, and you're really their guinea pig. And I don't think agents have built that trust up with them yet, which is one of the biggest value adds. So what's your thoughts, Pete?
It's a relatively low barrier to entry in real estate generally. So yes, you're right. If you're going to use a buyer's agent, you ideally want to see some level of experience, because it does take a bit of time, like any career or job, to actually see everything. You don't want to engage a buyer's agent who doesn't have experience, because you could really pick up problems. And for first-time buyers, as we always say, this is potentially the most important purchase they'll ever make, because if you do well, make a sensible purchase and grow some equity, you can then use that equity later on to progress through your journey. If you're not familiar with the terminology, an off-market property is one that isn't listed on realestate.com.au or domain. It's something that's sold via real estate agent channels for various reasons. Sometimes people deceased estates or divorces. Sometimes people would rather sell off-market than having open homes. I think what we often see, as Chris touched on there, is pre-market sales where somebody's getting ready to sell a property, but they haven't gone through the process of having the professional photography, doing the decor. And if you can be in a position to buy, if you've got mortgage pre-approval and an agent will give you a pre-market look at a property, that can be a really good way to buy with less competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think you need to get a little bit creative with it, but ultimately it's making friends with the real estate agents and getting them on your side, because they're the ones who really control what you're going to be able to see. So that was a great episode, Pete. 3 good stories. I'm sure there'll be another 3 big ones for us next week.
Absolutely, yeah. So to wrap up, the retreat from the regions. I mean, this is something we've been talking about for some time, but now it really does seem to be showing up in the numbers, especially in the rental market at the moment. Rental vacancies rising around regional Australia, but record lows back in the big cities. On the richest and poorest postcodes, I'm sort of reminded, there was a movie back in the late 1990s. I think it was Hugh Jackman, Erskineville Kings. where they're going around the inner west, they're sort of grimy, deserted streets and dingy pubs. But fast forward to today, massively gentrified location where people will go out for breakfast. The pubs have been upgraded now. They're quite nice places to go. But that's the top of the tree, Erskineville, for gentrification from a previously working class enclave to something that's pretty affluent today. And there's plenty of other examples on that list. Interesting Domain article if you can get your hands on it. And we'll put a link in the show notes. And finally, first home buyers, there's a whole range of new stimulus measures coming into play from 1 July. Stock levels are pretty low, though, so it's difficult buying conditions, but definitely worth checking out if you qualify for one of the new schemes. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining, and thanks, everyone, for tuning in. As always, please do send us your property questions. We'll put a link in the show notes, or even if you just want to say good day. Chris, we can get hold of you where? At Blusk, I believe, the newly rebranded company name.
That's right. I'll link in the show notes if you wanted to engage our service or at least have a chat, and obviously get involved with Pete's blog, the best daily email you're going to get. But also, I think you're off next week. I think Owen and I are doing this. Pete's doing a bit of a camper van trip, I think, from Brisbane to Sydney. Is that right?
Wish me luck. Yeah, the kids have been nagging me for years about doing a camper van trip. And of course, with COVID, I was excused this painful journey. But yes, I'm driving down from Gold Coast to Sydney over the next week. So big shoes to fill, of course. But Owen Rask, I'm sure, is well up to the job, and look forward to tuning in. I'll probably be at the Big Banana in Coffs Harbour or somewhere with screaming kids in the back. So wish me luck.
Awesome. And to our listeners, have a good Sunday.
Thank you. And we'll see you next episode. Cheers.